So as Tom said, I'm Jason Myer. I work for PCM as well as help out with the Military Foundation. And thank you all for being here. Quite the crowd. I've come here for 6 or 7 years now, and this is probably the best turnout we've ever had. I'm sure it's for this presentation and not for the free food and pesticide credits. So as Tom mentioned, I'm going to be talking about drones and how do we implement that technology into berry crops. So when we talk about drones, we see a lot of different terms used for them. Drones, UAVs, UAS, SUAS, and these are all just a bunch of acronyms that are essentially the same thing. UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles, some hobbyists decided that was more appropriate than drones. Then somebody was like, well, it's not really a vehicle necessarily, so let's call it a system. And then the US government, doing what it does best to complicate matters, decided, well, let's call it an SUAS for small unmanned aerial systems. So, for all intents and purposes, when you're talking about any of those, they are the same thing. They're unmanned, remotely controlled vehicles. They could be controlled by a computer or a person. And the purpose is that they carry some sort of instrument or tool to perform a particular task. They're also not necessarily airborne. So like some of these here, that's a automated grass seed spreader. This one here is a submersible thing. And then this one at the bottom is a kind of a cool little drone being developed for weeding an area of a field. So it just kind of goes around, it has a little sensor which identifies a weed, and then has a little kill thing to dig it up and kill it. But we're going to talk mostly, or all about unmanned aerial vehicles, so talking specifically about aerial drones. And kind of to go back to the origination of this technology, I kind of like history, and I think this has a kind of cool background. In 1849, Austria bombed Venice using unmanned aerial balloons, dropping 30 bombs on the city. That was the first use of an unmanned vehicle to do any sort of warfare or other activity, really. In 1898, Nikola Tesla invented an RC boat, which he brought to the World's Fair. He was almost burned at the stake for it too, because people thought it was some sort of witchcraft that he could control a vehicle without any sort of wire connection. And then in 1918, the US created the first true unmanned aerial vehicle with what was called the Caneberry bomb, which was basically a papier-mâché airplane connected to a torpedo that had a little barometer on it and would send it off flying and had a little remote signal that would just make it fall to the ground and blow up. It was never implemented. The only flight, they ended up crashing into some poor farmer's field in Ohio. And then that was followed by largely, 8 years or so of mostly military use of the technology. But as you're all probably aware, we've had a fairly big explosion of this technology in the recent past decade or so. Beginning in the 2000s, we saw a lot of commercial development of technologies. You can see here that there is just an explosion in the number of patents being submitted for UAV technology patents. Even going back to 2004, there was about 100 patents issued that year for UAV technology, and by 2014, that was already up to over 1,600. There's a crossroads of technologies. Largely, the smartphone was a big one. It has microprocessors capable of handling data, gyroscopes that knows what orientation it is, and kind of a three-dimensional environment, cameras, and just kind of general miniaturization. And then, kind of pretty quickly, a bunch of industries started seeing that, well, this could be really applicable to our use. The Amazon delivery drone kind of promise was probably the most notorious of that, where they were, or still are, planning to deliver packages at some point by a drone. And you can see here that in 2014, there was 2 commercial use permits issued by the FAA for use of aerial drones, and by 2016, that had grown to 3,100. At the end of 2016, the FAA changed the way it regulated the use of unmanned aerial vehicles in civilian airspace, and so now it's a individual license sort of thing. But even prior to that, you still have that much activity going on. So when we're talking about agriculture, there's a few ways that people see this technology being applied. Bird abatement is one of them. So it looks like a funny Photoshop, but that is actually a real drone. Some guy was kind of had a hobby for drones and taxidermy. So he had a dead cat he was particularly fond of that he turned into a drone, which I thought would work pretty effective for bird control and a lot of other control too. Kind of one of the other big areas that this technology is being developed is for spraying. This is a 15-liter sprayer developed by the company DJI that goes through a field. It's not quite there yet. I mean, you don't get very far with 15 liters of spray, but the technology is certainly developing and having automated systems and not having to put somebody at exposure risk. There's a lot of potential applications. So when there's aerial imagery, doing farm mapping, hyperspectral imagery, this is kind of the thing that's been developed the most and where the most immediate application is being seen. So that's what we're going to be talking about for pretty much the rest of this presentation. So what is field imagery all about? It's really just all about perspective, perspective, perspective. It's the going from the ground level to just a little bit of elevation at what Myer can see. So I have a little presentation or a little video to kind of demonstrate that kind of transition of going from the ground level up, and then that perspective you get from looking at things from above. So this was fairly recently when we had that snowstorm a couple weeks ago. But immediately kind of getting up and out of this field, and I apologize if there's any choppiness in the video, this computer's not particularly fast. So getting above the field, you can kind of see all these crops in a whole different angle and see things kind of as a whole, as opposed to when you're walking down the row, you're seeing individual plants or an individual row. Allows you to analyze things much quicker and see things that you can see patterns, particularly that might be visible. And then there's also a lot of potential here for marketing in terms of, farms are beautiful places and we live in a beautiful location, so getting that view from above is really quite extraordinary. We'll move on. So what can aerial imagery tell us about berry crops in particular? These 4 things are kind of the big holy grail of things that we want that imagery to tell us. I mean, how nice would it be if we could fly a drone and know a good range of what our yield is going to be, or be able to know specific nutrient, micronutrient deficiencies in fields and be able to manage appropriately. Irrigation and plant water management, also a huge potential of understanding where plants are getting overwatered and underwatered, and being able to manage irrigation and drainage systems. And also identifying and assessing severity of pests and diseases in the field, so that you don't have to send somebody out in the field. You can fly a drone and know exactly how much of that field is getting affected by various pests and diseases. However, the problem with this is that these particular applications have to be calibrated for every crop. It's not as simple as just flying over a blueberry field and saying like, oh, there you have a lot of botrytis going on in the field. It's much more difficult than that. When you're seeing a field like this, it's hard to delineate what exactly is going on here versus here. And for that, you have to have a lot of ground truthing, you have to do a lot of research, and when we're talking about berry crops particularly, they're much more complex than corn, wheat, soybeans, these field crops that are just ubiquitous across the entire field. You know, we're dealing with a three-dimensional plant architecture, having to deal with you know, intercropped rows and planting mounds and floricanes and primocanes when we're talking about caneberries, which can get really confusing when you're looking at imagery. However, there is research currently underway, and these two projects particularly are ones that are going to be going on this summer that are going to address a couple of these issues. This first one is a Washington State block grant that Dave Ryla is the project director on, and it is looking at using remote sensing imagery to enhance water management, so kind of getting at those irrigation issues. And then we have a project going on this summer using technology to begin understanding what pests and diseases we can identify in the field so that we can start figuring out means and algorithms which we can assess these fields for pest diseases and issues. So even though those kind of big four are not currently things we can get at from the imagery, there are a lot of ways which we can use this, use aerial imagery. So first off, we have high-resolution aerial imagery. It's a great tool. I mean, being able to see your fields at such a microscopic level compared to pretty much anything else is, it says a lot when you look at it. And to kind of give a comparison, you know, when we're talking about imagery, there's kind of three major platforms which imagery can come from. So we have satellites, and typically that imagery, it's between 30 and 85 centimeters per pixel. So that means, you know, when you're looking at a piece of ground, you're looking at an area, you know, yay wide, it's 1 pixel in that image. You're not getting a lot of detail in terms of the plant. When we go to manned aerial imagery, we start to get more detail. Usually manned aircraft can capture images at around 18 to 25 centimeters per pixel. So we can start seeing individual plants, planting rows, but not super finite details. So then, when we go to UAV imagery, we can get below 3 centimeters per pixel, where we can see individual leaves on the plant, grass clumps, and a lot of detail at the field. The other thing that most UAV platforms nowadays, they have sensors which are measuring elevation and relative ground height that they are above. So when they're flying the field, they're geospatially reporting their position and how far from the ground it is, as well as their altitude. So they create these elevation type maps. So flying a field, you can see even minor variations in elevation in the field. So here you see these dark areas are the low spots, and as it gets lighter, that's higher and higher. This can be really helpful for when planting a field, in terms of your irrigation, your drainage management, understanding the hydrology of a farm, the planting like drainage tiling. And also being able to correlate weak areas of the field. Sometimes it can be when you're standing in a relatively flat field, you don't necessarily see a low spot, but you see a weak plant, and you assume something's really amiss there, but a lot of times that is just a low spot where that water, even on a very relatively low area, is pooling and causing problems. The other thing is crop health and crop stress mapping. So here we have a strawberry field, and this is probably fairly familiar to people. The most kind of commonly known crop health map is NDVI imagery. And this is kind of what it produces. It's looking at what is healthy plant material in this area and what is not. And what isn't is in red, healthier plant materials in green. So You can use multispectral imagery to really see variations that the eye cannot see. You see plant stresses in near-infrared spectrum that are not visible with the naked eye. And though you can't identify specific causal agents, it's still very popular. You still see the relative plant stress in the field. So you can go out and say you see this area here, oh, that's really weak. You can go out on the ground and just look at that area and figure out what's going wrong there. Saying there's little patches in here where there's particular issues going on. So you can identify weaker, less vigorous areas of the field to prioritize picking. You know, if I was looking at this strawberry field, this is looking pretty nice area here, as opposed to trying to pick up here. You might just be wasting a lot of money on picker time. You can also map areas of spray damage from drift. You know, when your neighbor comes through, if they're your cousin, your brother, or who else, like, and they accidentally knock down all your caneberries with too much herbicide, you can map the field and show them the damage and take them to court. So let's talk about these crop health indexes real quick. There's quite a few of them. These are kind of the main three big ones, but there are dozens and dozens of them. And what they are is they're mathematical calculations that look at imagery across the various spectrums. So when we're talking about NDVI, we're taking the visual light spectrum, which is just this little sliver here in the rainbow color, and the near infrared spectrum right here, and it's overlaying those two and creating and then evaluating that and doing a bunch of math to determine, is this healthy plant photosynthetic material or is this unhealthy material? And that's essentially what all these algorithms are getting at, though they're kind of looking at it from a different angle. So there's small differences between these algorithms, but in order to not negate all the coffee you guys have drank today, I will leave it at that. So another potential use is for weed mapping. This particular area was a blueberry field, and you see these patches here, which unfortunately are not super lush, healthy blueberry plants, but are instead patches of morning glory. So being able to see very quickly where the weeds are in your field, identifying spread patterns in the field, you can map precision treatments for going on and effectively managing. And really kind of what this all gets at is layering this data all together. You have elevation maps, you have these crop health maps, you have just the high definition imagery, you can, and then you take that over time, you start to build up a very elaborate perspective on the field. So you can track relative changes over the course of the season, over the course of years, and be able to see how particular problem areas or stressed areas of the field react over time. And the last kind of use case I'll talk about is marketing and outreach. You know, just the aerial perspective is quite a pretty picture. So, who doesn't like a pretty picture? Marketing departments just really love it. So, kind of one of the questions get constantly is, can you as a farmer just go out and buy one of these things and implement, you know, this technology and go map your own fields and your own farm? And yeah, you certainly can. The aircraft and sensors that are used are widely commercially available. Like these two over here, that laser pointer doesn't quite reach, but the darker one over there is it's about a $4,000 platform. To get like a multispectral camera, you're probably looking at another $4,000. So it's not insanely expensive compared to other pieces of farm equipment. They're not particularly cheap. The white one there is about a $2,000 drone, and both of those are fully capable of mapping the field. There's many options for the image processing software, the mapping software. Those programs typically range around $100 a month to use. So costs start to add up when you're implementing on a farm, but depending on how much you're using it and how much value you're getting out of it, it can be worth it. And also, the intelligent flight systems for these drones is really pretty sophisticated. They're extremely easy to fly. You know, probably a 5-year-old would have no problem. Probably would be better than most of us at flying these things. You know, they take off. They just sit perfectly still until you tell it to move. When you're mapping a field, usually you're using a program that you just set the parameters for the flight. It takes off, does its whole route, and lands without you ever touching the controls. And then having an on-farm operation would certainly allow you to operate anytime you might want, which, you know, compared to having a service provider perform it, may not have that same degree of flexibility. However, there are some issues with kind of doing this, or some hurdles that you have to overcome if you want to do that on farm. First, for any commercial activity, the FAA requires you to be licensed with them. And they have a pretty broad definition for that. So if it's for any activity that's making money, so if you bought this aircraft and then like wanted to write it off on your taxes, technically you'd be using it for commercial activity. So you have to get a FAA license, which is, you know, it's not terribly difficult to get. It's just a written test that you have to go take, but it takes a little bit of studying if you're not very familiar with aeronautical charts and rules and regulations. So there's that hurdle. There's liability. My wife is a lawyer, so I always have to add this in because she always reminds me of everything that, you know, somebody could do and sue me for. So you drop or your drone fell on one of your farm workers' head, you might have an issue. And then there's also the cost. So, you know, really the service is being able to just hire somebody to do this in the field is relatively inexpensive on a per acre basis. So weighing the cost of going through the study time, buying the drone, having the software, and then having the on-farm knowledge to use these things may or may not outweigh the ease of just telling somebody to come to the field and do it for you. And then, in addition to the other things you have to know, you have to have a pretty good understanding of photography. You know, these are all cameras, and you have to understand what focal length and various other like camera parameters that you might need to use in the field. And lastly, you don't want to be this guy. If it loads. So in about 3 seconds, he just wasted $3,000. And that's really not that uncommon of a thing to happen. Look at YouTube and have a pretty hilarious time looking at drone fails of people, you know, going on Amazon and buying their $4,000 drone and then immediately crashing it when they get it. And there's no coming back from that. That thing is total. So again, that might go into your assessment of whether or not to implement this on farm. I've talked to a number of people who have done that exact thing, and they've asked questions of like, how do you get a drone out of a 100-foot tall tree? I don't know. I don't have that answer. So there's a couple options currently available for some shameless self-promotion. We do provide these services, and costs typically range between $2 to $10 an acre on the farm. In addition to that, there's a company called Caneberry that uses airplanes to collect imagery, and it's a really pretty good product that they have. Kratom Co-op and AgTel are service providers for that service here in Oregon. There are various stipulations, but certainly that's something that you're interested in. The cost there, the difference being that they fly multiple flights a season, and so that cost there is for multiple flights, 6 or more usually is what people are getting from a single season. And with this technology, it's really advancing quickly, so we're going to see a lot of other service providers and new and different technologies being implemented with this technology. With that, that is it. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And if I have some time left, I have a minute. Any questions?
Yes. Anybody looking into those for like patrolling fields to get rid of birds?
Yeah, so
To scare them away?
Yeah, so with the bird abatement issue, there's a couple of things. Certainly it's enough to scare them away. These things are pretty noisy and sound like a really angry bee as they're going through a field. So they scare off birds for sure. I think the thing people want to see is to have these automated systems where a drone will take off from a landing plat or a port, fly around, scare off birds, come back, recharge, and do the whole thing again. The unfortunate thing is that current FAA regulations limit how you can use that because the regulations state that you have to have a person there in control and within line of sight of that drone at all times. So when you have that added labor cost, it may not be the easiest way of bird control. Hopefully that will change.
Have you heard with guys trying to scare them off, any birds attacking the drone, flocks, and the drone being taken out on his
Yeah, you know, that's certainly one of the common things. If those YouTube drone fail videos, you'll see the occasional eagle or osprey just go after it and like knock it right out of the sky. You know, something like that white one would probably not be on the better side of a bird encounter. The darker colored drone over there, that thing's beefy enough where there's probably not a bird that's going to knock it out of the sky. They don't really tend to harass it unless they're feeling threatened if you're flying it like into or around the nesting site. So yeah, it's certainly possible with like starlings and a lot of the birds we have here. You know, they're usually all just they're just like free type of bird.
Jason headed up one day and you had, what was it, following it, what was it?
Yeah, I had a bald eagle following it. He was kind of checking it out for a while. It was nerve-wracking, but I left it around. So.
Any other questions? I might give Paul or somebody from Prattle a chance just to say something about Tier 8 in that service, because it's pretty new too. And we're all trying to figure out how to integrate all these different sensor platforms. There's obviously uses for this. It's going to take us a little while to really get down to field level uses, although irrigation seems to be kind of a low-hanging. You can pick up little spots on irrigation really quick. Do you want to say something, Paul, about Terra Even?
Well, yeah, it's a program that we get 6 to 8 flights, and the cost is really, really low because we use 2 pilots that are trained for aviation classes, and the cost is like $6 to $7 an acre, and that includes all of those 6 to 8 flights. And they're during the growing season. The imagery is very, very good. And it just helps you to identify problems in the field and gives a field scout kind of pinpoints areas of the field that are under stress and gives you things to look at so you can start solving the problems. So pretty good program. We're pretty excited about it. So if you got more questions, feel free to call and Matt and Paul will be happy to give you a demonstration and show you what we have.